Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Explorer Show. I'm your host, Vineet. This is not just any other new episode. This is our Golden Jubilee episode, the 50th episode. And our podcast has come a long way, a little more than a year, 13 months or so. Started very small, and I really didn't expect when I started out that we'll reach 50 episodes. So it's been great to reach out here till now. And as it's the 50th episode, I have a very special guest with me here today to celebrate this occasion, a long-time supporter of the podcast, Harsh Madhusudhan Gupta. Welcome to the show. Namaste, Harsh.
Hi Vineet, how are you doing? Namaste. I'm not at all surprised that you've hit 50 episodes, including this one, because I actually remember us discussing about a year ago when you were just chatting about, right? So apologies for taking so long to come onto your show, but I'm so happy that it's getting traction, and I'm sure it will further exponentially, get more traction in the coming days.
Absolutely. And since this show has been almost 1 year in the making, I'm going to extract my pound of Shylock flesh in this one.
That's
So,
slightly anti-Semitic, but never mind. Yes.
we are going to start this discussion with the long India,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll talk further about Dharmatva as well, so a concept on which you've written for Swarajya. So, talking about long India, and you have always been bullish about India as an economy, in terms of its future potential, right? And which is kind of in the complete opposite side of the spectrum of Abhijit, who comes on slightly from a pessimistic tone, although his heart is in the right place. And I kind of come somewhere in between, I think. So, what makes you so bullish about India?
See, we have to understand the Indian context and where I'm coming from. We have to see the global context. The global context is that roughly in the last 300 years, I mean, some people say 500 years, some people say 200 years, there was a massive divergence, what some people call the Great Divergence, between the West and the rest in terms of economic performance. Some people also, I would say, rightly call it the Great Enrichment, in the sense it was more the West getting richer than the rest getting poorer. Although the rest also got poorer, partially because of colonialism, exploitation, etc. But they didn't get as much poor as the West got rich. So overall, it was partially a zero-sum game. It was not fully a zero-sum game. So the Great Enrichment or the Great Divergence is what basically defines the economic and, to some extent, political economic history of the world for the last, say, 300 years. Now, the Great Enrichment, I would argue, continues. The Great Divergence for the last generation about has finally gotten converted into the Great Convergence. Now, of course, if it's a 300-year trend and I'm saying that it's a 20-year reversal, then it's really not long enough data for people to be absolutely certain, right? So there is some conditionalities involved. That is why it's a hypothesis. It's not a settled fact. So with that being the context to begin with, just to give you an example, at least in nominal dollar terms, of course, you have to adjust for cost of living, etc. But in nominal cost of living terms, if I'm not wrong, the average American is 30 times richer, or has 30 times slightly more, perhaps this year, income than the average Indian. Now, the median might be slightly different, etc., etc. There are a lot of nuances, but basically, it's around 30 times, and it's almost 10 times, even if you adjust for cost of living. So the big question is the world really in a great convergence? If so, based on what conditionalities, to what extent? And where does India fit into that? Right? Because if our starting point is fundamentally human beings are genetically the same, more or less. I mean, there can be a lot of debates, and there are a lot of nuances there also about the out of Africa branch and the African branches having a lot more diversity, etc., etc. I encourage people to read people like Razib Khan on that. But I think, broadly speaking, those small differences aside, human beings are mostly the same. And a lot of the essentialism that we attribute to different groups is based on culture. And culture, while of course long standing, is not literally inherited by blood. I mean, there is something halfway called epigenetics, but basically most human beings are the same. And even if they are not that same, that absolutely similar, the kind of divergences in income we see, they're definitely not that different, right? So then the question is, what is it that makes a country or a society rich? What is it that holds it back? And if we finally are getting close to that secret sauce of what makes a country or society rich, then fundamentally human beings roughly the same. If the average Indian, for example, has the same per capita income as the average American, we'll automatically have 4 times larger economy than the US because we have slightly more than 4 times the population. If the average Indian is just 1/4 as rich as the average American, we will overtake the US economy because we have slightly more than 4 times the number of people. So the issue with discussing long India, what I call long India, and what I'm currently finishing a book on, my third book on, is that it gets too much lost in the details about India. So of course that is extremely, extremely important. But the first aspect must first look at the global context. Now, what has happened is, why did the divergence kind of continue for 200, 300 years? And what really happened in the last 25, 30 years that we're at least talking about a great convergence, even though we are not fully sure? I mean, so one simple or rather simplistic answer is China, etc., etc. A broader, a slightly more sophisticated answer is globalization. But putting it even more in more depths of political philosophy, what is growth? Growth, and we'll come to this later, it requires both free markets and state capacity. Free market is a shorthand for incentives, for individual incentives. State capacity is a shorthand for group coordination and organization, right? So there are some things that groups can do better. For example, to build infrastructure, you need something called eminent domain, right? If there is a straight expressway or straight bullet train path going, and there is literally one guy in the middle who won't sell his property, you can't spend like another $100 million having a roundabout for the bullet train. So you have something called eminent domain, right? So there is state capacity involved. Just to take a very basic example, then similarly on education, on public goods which have some positive network externalities, where the social benefit is higher than the private benefit, etc., etc. There are many nuances, but broad point is the great debate that we had in the 20th century about communism versus capitalism ultimately turned out to be a head fake, in the sense that, of course, broadly the capitalist system won, but the capitalist system won by mostly becoming a social welfare market democracy, right? Those are the countries which are the richest in the world, except a few city states. I mean, Singapore, borderline, Hong Kong, now it's been absorbed into China, and there are a few small petro states like Qatar or Brunei and so on and so forth. Most big societies actually are fairly redistributive, but they're redistributive in a way that they, to the extent possible, minimize the impact on individual economic business incentives. So this state capacity is absolutely essential, and getting it just about right. If you get it too tyrannical, you end up like the Soviet Union. And it's an open question right now whether the Chinese model going forward, having become, China is about at $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 per capita income. India is at $2,500. The US is between 75 and 80. It's an open question whether the Chinese, given that the system is based on hardcore infra, manufacturing, exports, things that are relatively easier to coordinate. But going forward, if you need more services, domestic consumption, innovation, without the big kind of state looking down on you all the time, it's an open question whether the middle income track, whether it exists or not, will it apply to China or not. As of this moment, we don't know. Famous economists like Paul Samuelson, if I'm not wrong, in the 1960s in the textbooks were saying that in 10, 15 years, the Soviet Union will overtake the US in per capita income. That never happened. The system kind of collapsed on itself. So as of now, the best model remains just the perfect amount of balance of state capacity with individual initiative. Now, India historically does not have the tradition of a strong state. Actually, I mean, in all of the non-Western world, to some extent, the Chinese have had it for a long time, but even that is a more kind of retrospective, nostalgia, romantic view of things. It was also a relatively quasi-feudal system. At least they had a state continuity, which the Indians did not. The state system, and which is where we will discuss this in more depth in Dharmatva discussion. The state system actually, the modern state system came out of Christian civil wars in Europe, right? So what Abrahamism brought was not equality or egalitarianism the way some of its defendants, apologists, and supporters call. It really brought organization. So human society, human history is a trend of larger and larger and more complex coordination of bigger and bigger groups. So, you go from small kingdoms to bigger kingdoms to empires. And the two proselytizing Abrahamic religions were basically saying we are universal while being homogenizing. And it worked for a while. For example, Europe got converted to Catholicism when they kind of ran out of pagans, and then they hit the wall of Muslims. Then they divided amongst themselves. The Germans became Protestant and so on and so forth. Similarly, in the Middle East, when they ran out of kind of heathens or kafirs to convert, Iran became Shia, right? And that the Middle Eastern thing is still going on. That problem is not fully solved. But in Europe, they solved it initially by creating these what became modern nation states, the kind of Westphalian settlement. And they were competing with each other. They were doing wars against each other, for which they built public finance, for which they built armies and better weapons, and then infrastructure. That is the beginning of modern growth and capitalism, etc. Where if you build infrastructure, which helps a lot in trading and specialization and productivity, it is very difficult to do it in a very decentralized system. So the state system, because of this long arc of colonialism, India, which was not Abrahamic, was kind of responding to it. Through this post-colonial period, India finally had a modern state. And we initially obviously made a lot of mistakes, but in the larger scheme of things, those were to be expected because we had not really wielded power for a long time. And we just, in the larger scheme of things, we're just finally getting it right, having done the basic errors. We are finally getting manufacturing, infrastructure, etc., right. So therefore, it should not be a surprise in this context that if you get the basics of education, manufacturing, infrastructure, services correct, that fundamentally the average Indian should not be too different from the average American. And obviously, in this case, scale helps. Now, there's only basically the Western scale, Indian scale, and Chinese scale. And potentially in 30, 40 years, the African scale if they manage to get united. Scale matters a lot because scale helps you build more and more complexity and specialization of labor. So India finally was able to use its large internal market for its own growth, as opposed to others exploiting or extracting resources from here. Right? A classic example is the British made the rails, but they was mostly to get out stuff from India or to sell their own wares. And that also at Indian expense, at very high kind of rates of interest, etc. There's no charity involved there. We are finally in the process of creating one large integrated market. Using that scale, we are saying if you want to sell cell phones in India or cars in India, you should manufacture in India. Even if you're a foreign manufacturer, and most people end up saying, okay, fine, you know what, we'll do it because it's a 1.4 billion potential large market. So to leverage that scale, you need one united government, you need a relatively cohesive polity, you need a stable polity. And I mean, there's a big question mark on the stability of the CCP going forward. Because they had a collective leadership system. People were quote unquote dictators for 10 years, but then they handed it off to the next dictator, except this one, Xi Jinping, who's now gone to his third term, kind of back to the Maoist framework as opposed to the Deng framework. So if you look around the world, there is really no large, stable polity which is coming from such a low base. And therefore, in that context, it's not surprising at all because the only other large part of the world which has a low base is Africa, or rather sub-Saharan Africa. But that's not one polity. So if you believe in convergence, if you believe that democratic stability by and large gives you the room to make a few mistakes and then converge economically, it should not be surprising, therefore, that if you're starting even today at $2,500 per capita income, and the world frontier, so to speak, is 30 times more, although we can get into more details later. The world frontier is no longer just a country. It's more like a transnational economic elite, but never mind. So it's a 30 times difference, or 10 times it almost adjusted for cost of living. and you have a long runway of the basic system being stable. You have peace, you have internal specialization. So, and of course, the technology is connecting the world. It's not, you can actually go, and the way we are doing this podcast, we can work with each other across, not just sitting in the same city, but across the world. And that has allowed and will continue to allow the average Indian to converge to the global frontier. So the global frontier will continue to enrich, the great enrichment, but this great divergence, at least in the case of India, will continue at pace. So it becomes a tailwind, a double tailwind. And that really is the long story short. That first you have to contextualize it in the global context, and then you're not surprised about, oh my god, we managed to grow at 7% again for 3 years, despite a lot of naysayers saying we'll not be able to do this for this and that reason for 2 years, 5 years, right? People, even now, people have the Goldman Sachs just came out with a so-called bullish India report that by 2075 the Indian economy will overtake the US economy. But that means by 2075 the average Indian will still be one-fourth of the income as the average American, right? I mean, and so a lot of it is just inertia, where you see the world as it is, and then you say, well, it cannot move that much in my lifetime, except that the Chinese surprise them. And what I suspect and what I analyze based on my proprietary research, based on whatever, I mean, professionally I'm an investor, by vocation I'm an author, based on whatever models I keep or develop or observe, that this convergence will happen much faster in the case of India, because almost all factors which are headwinds for the rest of the world are tailwinds for India. Demographics, debt, as in we are starting from a low debt situation, just digitalization for India, of course, even this so-called deglobalization in manufacturing, not so much in services, is a huge tailwind for India, because we were never really that integrated in the manufacturing supply chains, in fact, right? So this whole China plus one, etc. All these factors, which you can hear all in the popular pink press today, are broadly correct. I'm not giving you a very new reason. I can get into a few ones here or there, but I just think the pace of change will be much higher than what most people are at least publicly estimating.
Okay, so a couple of things that I want to ask you when you talk about convergence, because 2047 we are talking about the size of the economy of India kind of crossing China and the US, right? But per capita is still not going to converge. So that's going to
So
take even
2047 is my kind of baseline thesis, where we become the world's largest economy. As I just said,
right.
Goldman Sachs came out with the prediction that India overtakes the US in 2075, and even then remains number two, because China is number one, as per the Goldman Sachs latest projection.
Okay.
So you're right that if in 2047 we become the world's number one economy. If we become the world's number one economy by overtaking the Chinese, then we are more or less overtake them on per capita income as well. We'll have a larger population than the Chinese then by, say, 20% by then.
Correct.
Uh, so it's not a huge difference. Of course, it does not mean, therefore, that we overtook the US only in 2047. We might overtake them in 2040, say, for example. Still, I think it's unlikely that in hard dollar per capita terms, we
Yeah.
overtake them by 2047. Although I think it might actually happen maybe a decade after that, which is also, I mean, see, if it happens, say, by 2060, I'm just giving you a round, rough number. That means by 2060, we are four times the US economy, right? So it's a very interesting point of time where, one geoeconomic analogy from just before the First World War is the UK, and of course, like all analogies, it's hardly perfect. The UK was very kind of stressed about Germany and Russia. France by then had kind of become less powerful after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Germany had united, so had Italy, but they were very concerned over the Russians taking over their Indian empire, which is the Great Game, and the Russians entering Central Asia, and Germany rapidly industrializing, on the brink of creating a navy, despite the fact that the British royal family was essentially Germanic in origin. And in all this fight, the winner ended up being the US. So it's very similar. I see very much the current Indian situation as the American situation of the late 19th century, where the US currently plays the UK's role, what UK did back then. And you can choose between Germany and Russia as today's China and Russia, for example. So there is a big geo-economic drop to that as well, because the Chinese grew in a backdrop where the US needed them to weaken the Soviet Union. The Indians are growing in the backdrop where the Americans need the Indians to weaken the Communist Chinese Party. And it's one of those things where everybody involved, all the parties involved, understand exactly what's happening, but you can't really do much about it. Which is why, for example, Narendra Modi goes to Washington, D.C., is one of the few leaders in all of history to address the U.S. Congress twice, and there are people foaming at the mouth, and they still can't do anything about it. I mean, it's not something to take lightly or laugh. Of course, we should first try to dispel any misunderstandings and communicate better, etc., etc. But having said that, some people will never come around to our point of view, right? So it just shows that along with this whole demographic, debt, digitalization, deglobalization in manufacturing relatively, but not services, and of course, a broader state capacity and state capacity in general, you have to go to the civilizational aspect of it, which will come in the second half of this discussion. Why is it, if it is really true that the world's largest economies will once again be the world's largest polities, which is exactly what convergence implies, right? Because till about 1700, the world's richest parts, large parts, or maybe twice as rich as the world's poorest parts. Again, large parts, not just one or two cities. Whereas today, that's more like a factor of 10, even adjusting for cost of living, more like a factor of 20. So it's not like people were exactly the same even in medieval or ancient times, but the gap was not as pronounced. So therefore, what that meant was the world's largest economies were basically the world's largest populations. And now what I am saying is, if it's true that because of, even if nothing else, you cannot really innovate too much in one part of the world and kind of hide that innovation from the rest of the world, so to speak. And Indians were not really aware that the British were building an excellent navy to literally go around the world. Except under the Marathas and earlier under the Tamils, we hardly seafaring, right? Now you cannot do that. Now everybody really knows what the other person is doing. So that kind of convergence is just no longer palatable. And in that sense, the late 20th century was an extreme case just after formal decolonization. But really, people across Africa and Asia were just still finding their footing, whereas the West kind of raced ahead, with the big exception of Japan. So I think it's very important to understand the fact that if convergence is true, then again the world's largest polities become the world's largest economies. Then, of course, a deeper question which will come on later is, why is it that India is the world's largest polity? Because if it's that one-to-one correlation almost, that largest polity being largest economy, therefore then you have to go deeper and ask, why is it that this country is the largest polity?
So, as a side note, before we further go into the thesis of Long India, do you think national borders and nation states will become more relevant in the coming decades? Or do you think we are moving to a more transnational world, in the sense that supply chains, manufacturing supply chains, increasingly make countries form alliances and become dependent on each other? Like, for example, with rare earth metals in China. So India would probably need to diversify either via Africa or Australia, right? So there has to be some kind of economic coming together. COVID also taught us that in hard times, you only count on your country.
See,
So
it's about just in case is what the punchline is, not just in time. So what you're getting at is absolutely right. So you still need economic integration. You don't need autarky. You just don't need absolute seamless integration. Because the issue with absolute seamless integration is, if one guy plays it mercantilist, i.e. the Communist Chinese Party, especially in the recent history, and the other guy is playing it all open borders, which is effectively what India did. Relatively speaking, in 1995, we joined what was known as ITA, the Information Technology Agreement of WTO, and overnight all our electronic hardware manufacturing thing kind of got wiped out, and all those small and medium manufacturers ended up becoming importers from Guangzhou or this or that region of China. So no, absolutely. I mean, economic integration never fully go away. It's just more about having more buffers, more redundancies, more diversification of supply chains. It's not about going fully inside. Maybe in one or two strategic areas. Will nation states in general be more relevant? I hate to give this answer, but the answer is both yes and no. In the sense that it will never be the nation states. There is nothing above nation states in terms of organizing humanity, right? And in fact, all of us should be really afraid about just one entity organizing humanity, because if, God forbid, that entity has an autocrat of any sorts, there is no kind of letting go of steam. There is no alternate, right? There is no competition. At the same time, I think more and more imagined communities, which also then become real in a political sense at some level, will also happen precisely because of the global nature of communication. Even if, as I said, globalization might wane a bit on the margin in manufacturing, in terms of data, in terms of bytes, if not atoms. This world is only going to get more and more globalized. People will get both more and more fine-tuned individualistic tastes, but also a more kind of global backdrop. I mean, look at the pop. I was talking to somebody who said, her teenage daughter is absolutely crazy about K-pop, and I mean, this like a middle class Mumbai person. If you give an example of Hollywood, then people say, well, okay, whatever. There's an old obsession. It's subconscious colonial bias, etc., etc., whatever. I'm just giving you a deliberate example of something new and non-Western. And similarly, there are a lot of people who kind of appreciate Indian entertainment or Indian food around the world, and as the diaspora spreads, and then more organically, even beyond the diaspora. So I think there will be more and more, and Dharmat will be a good topic to discuss this on. But there will be more and more transnational political communities, but fundamental organizing form of human civilization, at least until we don't become interplanetary, will remain the nation state. The nation state might become large, and you can start calling them civilizational states, like the European Union is basically an Indian Union wannabe. So you can have more and more scale, right? So that in a way represents Westphalia too, the new kind of settlement of consensus, right? That not exactly Samuel Huntington's, but not exactly Francis Fukuyama either, right? And it's not clash of civilizations, but there might be something at the center of that civilizational state which has a civilizational identity, right? As the name suggests, but not necessarily clashing with each other in that sense. They will remain very relevant. They might just get larger in size, but there will be a lot of imagined, and therefore, ultimately, what is imagined becomes real. Political and emotional communities, which will be more transnational as well,
Oh,
and that obviously had an impact on economics as well.
okay. So your thesis of Long India has three broad areas which you cover. The first one is demographic, the second one is infrastructure and state capacities, and the third one is technology, right? So let's go into each. So the first one is demographic, and to me, I think this is the most vital one. For some reason, I think it's not been discussed enough, at least in India, because yes, we are at the peak of our demographic dividend, but I'm talking from the future point of view. Our population fertility has started going below the replacement level. There are only 4 states in India which are above replacement level, and it's likely to go down there also in 10 to 15 years max. So, given this scenario, now I understand that we have that graph where younger population is very high, and then as you age, it's going. But I think that window seems like 20 years. After that, we are going the route of Japan, and not that, not that dramatically, but that's the route we also seem to be going in.
So that the graph is what's known as the population pyramid. You're absolutely right that Indian TFR in aggregate is, I think the number from a year or two ago was 2.1, which is replacement fertility, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that we've already fallen slightly below TFR. That's on an aggregate basis across incomes, across religions, across regions, across everything. However, there's a long time gap from a child being born to a child being a productive citizen, especially in a more and more educated age. Let's say that's 25 years. So which is why some UN statistics used to historically consider 15 plus as the working age population. For all of my analysis, I basically choose 25 to 65. People used to choose 20 to 60, but then of course a lot of people are also healthier now in their early 60s. A lot of the people are in services jobs, consulting jobs, or less physically taxing jobs, and therefore I think it just seems reasonable to have a 25 to 65 rough cutoff for women. Of course, there is kind of especially for women, men also increasingly as social chores change, but especially for women, there is the maternity kind of gap. Now, they might still get married before 25, but on average, 25 to 65 seems like a reasonable number. So I think, so I just forgot, I didn't check, but I've put interesting graphs on that on Twitter a few weeks ago. So the new cohorts are, as we discussed, already narrower at the very bottom. So I think this is the year where I think 2001 or 2002, don't quote me on the exact year, is when the most number of Indians were born, something like that. So 2020s is basically when that most number of Indians enter the workforce happens. But even when most number of Indians enter the workforce happens, so let's say in the late 2020s, every incremental cohort which hits 25 is now smaller than the last cohort. But that is much bigger than the cohort which is exiting from 65. So do you see how graphically that is, right? So the biggest cohort which enters 25 might be in this decade. And after that, every other cohort that enters the age of 25 is slightly smaller and smaller and smaller. But that slightly smaller cohort is much bigger than the cohort which is going from 64 to 65 to 66. Those, because it was a pyramid, right? It was much narrower at the top. So the overall 25 to 65 aggregate number will keep on increasing for another generation, right? So even though the 20s working age population will start very marginally shrinking by the end of the decade or a bit earlier, the overall working age population will continue to rise for a
How
good
long?
30 years, again, maybe 25, 30 years. So I think your guess was right, maybe a bit on the conservative side, it's a bit longer than that. But the Indian demographic story is not just that. It is about two, three things more. A, how many people are in the working age group? B, how many of them actually want to work? And C, how many of them work? And then, of course, D&E is about how productive and educated and experienced they are. But let's put that in productivity / technology, and we come to that later. Just on the hard numbers. So this is the big thesis: the 25 to 65 age group in India versus 25 to 65 age group in China. We will increase by more than 200 million in the next 25 years. They might decrease by around 200 million in the next 25 years, or 150 million. So the differences in the working age populations, the differences in the working age population of India and China over the next one generation is all of the US population. Every man, child, woman, retired person, etc. So it's a huge difference. And India is the only large kind of growing economy that's adding people, right? I mean, large parts of Africa and to some extent Middle East or the broader Islamic world is also. But then again, they're not one coherent nation state. They don't have one coherent economic strategy right now. And especially Sub-Saharan Africa are further along the demographic transition, as in further behind on the demographic transition. So they will be where India is maybe in another generation. So the number that's the overall numbers. That's kind of raw numbers. Then there is labor force participation. I think it's fair to assume that most men who can get a job do get a job of some sorts, or productive employment or business or something like that. Female labor force participation in India, reported numbers are very low. There are a couple of points that if people have done more realistic studies, augmented FLP, female labor force participation rates, and those are
It's dropped, right? The numbers have dropped a little, especially urban women.
dropping over the last 10-15 years. I'll come to that. So basically, the headline number is we are not in the 20s, we are more like in the 40s, which is still low compared to large parts of emerging Asia, for example. But it's not as low as some parts of the Middle East, for example. And it's not about religion. I mean, Bangladesh, for example, has a very good female labor force participation rate. So it's not, that might be one of the factors, not the entirety of the factor. So there is an augmented number, which is a better reported number, but there is something which you can call to be a U curve effect, right? I mean, it's a bit simplistic. So it was whereby very poor women work and very rich women work, and the U curve transition is in the middle, where there's a bit of a social status thing, where quote unquote your women are not working, um, rural areas or urban areas. But then as you get richer, and the next generation of women get educated, and then it just becomes socially unacceptable, or just even from the point of view of the educated daughter, etc., to not allow them to work. And therefore this U curve kind of transition. So you have to slice the data into rural and urban, and then by education. But broadly, this U curve thesis applies, and broadly, women, while overall labor force participation rate being still quite bad, is not as bad as some of the headline number shows. So that's the second thing. So in India, so you can see that this overall demographic number is one tailwind, headwinds in most part of the world. And then the women labor force participation rate already maxed out in the West and China. And Japan actually came to this a bit later, but Japan is now kind of maxing out on that or getting close to it. Another tailwind in India. Then the third part is obviously how many of them work. Like with economic, there is always some kind of floating population, because remember, unemployment is defined as a percentage of those people who are looking to work but don't work, which need not be the same as the overall labor force. You can drop off the labor force in macroeconomic kind of jargon. As you grow faster and in kind of cyclical upturns and more secular upturns, it's you more people want to be part of the labor force. And I think there's a lot of slack in the Indian labor market. So then there'll be a lot of people who just colloquially might be, reading newspapers or playing tash in a village common square, because it's just not the agricultural season right now. It's not the kind of sowing or kind of harvesting season. And they might do a few days of NREGA, or some of them might go to the cities for some time. But there's a lot of basically friction and downtime involved, which is why the new economy, things like this delivery gigs and Uber, Ola kind of jobs are excellent, because at least people who want to be productive in kind of short part-time bursts can at least choose to be productive. So it removes some of the slack of the market. So that's a broad demographic story, that we're just adding hundreds of millions of people, whereas the rest of the world is losing it. Then there is the women's labor force participation lever, which I think has turned the corner if you look at the numbers. So it's kind of bottomed out, is what my preliminary observation is of that U curve. Of course, there are many different states that are different sections of the U curve, and urban, rural, etc. And then finally, as the economy grows faster, you'll find a lot of people who you did not expect to be in the labor force will come out in the labor force. So that's the raw numbers. Now, then you have to say how productive they are, right? I mean, it's a demographics is not just about numbers; it's about human capital. And in India, there's almost near 100% universal literacy for young people, say below the age of 30. Might be 97, 96%, something like that, right? And it's already this complete convergence for men, women, boys, and girls. And the quality of education may leave a lot to be desired. But remember, the ASER survey, the Pratham survey that we often see for numbers, because there's simply no other private sector or NGO kind of comprehensive report, is basically for rural India. It's not all India. And there was a consistent uptick in budget private schools, except the pandemic, when a lot of kids went back to government schools because you got free food, etc. there, and there was a lot of short-term economic difficulties. But the long-term trend is towards private schools in urban and rural areas. Economic education quality is not that great. For example, we are not participating in PISA, the international survey, where the Chinese did very well, but there also only 2 or 3 of the best cities participated. It's not all of China, Shanghai, etc. So the quality leaves much to be desired. A lot of public policy interventions to do in terms of teacher unions, etc. But nonetheless, quantity has its own quality, and there is now literacy across the board. And they might not be able to do in class 5 what class 5 people are supposed to do, but they might be able to do at class 5 what class 2 people are supposed to do, and in class 10 what class 6 people are supposed to do, and which is not nothing. Ideally, you want class 10 to be class 10. But if you're a high school graduate and you can do by class 7, class 8 standards of basic English, writing, mathematics, that's not bad. Because along with basic computers, and all of them are increasingly digital natives, right? They're all first basic phones and now smartphones. So, if you give them an Android kind of pad for some corporate job, sales job, they can all handle it very well. In that sense, they're digitally native. So it's a massive expansion of labor force who are numerate and literate, not excellently educated, but and frankly, from the college point of view, the GER, the gross enrollment ratio, is increasing. I think it's around 25 or 30%. But beyond a point, there are diminishing returns there. The point is, it should be open to everybody. I think Sanjeev Sanyal wrote a good piece, and a lot of people have said that we should have more and more modular kind of credits that you can add up to build a degree, especially if you're not doing a hard engineering or science or medical kind of degree, right? And you should have the flexibility that if you study so much of history across credits, it adds up to a BA history degree, for example. So I think those things are happening. Education is there. And finally, the real productivity happens on the job. It's just training. And there it's very interesting that, India is doing a lot of manufacturing industrial trade policy, which is required to bring that production. But see, if you're somebody on a manufacturing job for 3-4 years to earn some pocket money before you start a family or before you start a small business, that's understandable. But there is no it's much more productive than agriculture, which is why this kind of Lewis transition happens. But there is no next logical step, right? Maybe one out of 100 might become a middle manager on the factory or something like that. But in services, that ratio might be more like 1 in 10. A lot of people who were in their early 20s or late teens in colleges doing a BPO internship 10, 15 years ago, by virtue of the communication skills, etc., and frankly, we speak in English, which is, whether we like it or not, it's another whole language, political, civilizational debate. But right now, we are speaking in English, and which is very much the global language of science and commerce. And people always say France, Germany, Korea, Japan. Well, the reality is, even in European Union now, they're talking to each other in English, despite Brexit, or maybe because of Brexit. So there is an element of Indians, once they get onto the services job kind of stepping stone ladder, they are naturally more and more productive automatically in the next 20-30 years of their career. Because it's just that as the services jobs proliferate, services exports are booming, and a lot of Indian entrepreneurs and companies are serving Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, the kind of global South. They kind of take various positions. There is a natural increase in productivity that is not there beyond the first 1 or 2 steps in manufacturing. So the real human capital addition happens in raw numbers, and then in education, female labor force participation increasing, but in rightly measured, and finally on the job training. And as jobs get more formalized, we are still in early stages, and more and more people. Why is it that people are so crazy about government jobs in India? Because government jobs in India are jobs for life, and except at the very top levels, where there are other perks of prestige and maybe some pilferage. At the entry level jobs, these are much better paying jobs, and also jobs for life. So you'll find, a master's degree holder applying for some clerical level job in some grade A or B railway subdivision, etc., and part of UP or Bihar, because then he's set, and within his community he can go and ask for a bride, because that is how it works, and he's set, ladka set ho gaya, or ladki set ho gayi. So there is an element of that, which I think it's not going away. It's just is being overwhelmed by private sector jobs in terms of sheer numbers. So I think that is what is encouraging, that there is ultimately the real productivity happens by people just entering the labor force, and does not seem to be a dead end or a cul-de-sac for the Indian kind of model, which is both services and manufacturing, and not just domestic services, the way it is for perhaps the classic East Asian model.
Okay. So, do you think that skipping manufacturing and directly going into services is a good thing, or do you think that having a manufacturing base will be important for the convergence to happen?
Absolutely not a good thing, and I mean, at least I'm not endorsing that at all. It seems like Raghuram Rajan seems to be speaking in that tone. No, it's not either or. See, this either or implies as if every single Indian has a very tight schedule, is completely properly employed, and as if you take away one person into services, Or sorry, if you take one person into manufacturing, you somehow have one less person for services. That's not how the real world of frictional employment and unemployment, the anecdotes I was giving you of off-season people sitting in village squares, or for the matter uh, in our cities, and not really doing much. So that despite some improvement because of technology, etc. So we have to do both, because if you can use that industrial trade policy to get some automobile manufacturing components or ancillaries or cell phone and semiconductors gradually to India, and then that value addition, either through a joint venture with a foreign company or some equity ownership in India or some salaries or some taxes or some dividends, plows some of that money back, some of the value addition back into the Indian economy, as opposed to all of it going to the US, Europe, South Korea, or Japan. And then that, of course, sustains a lot of other kind of jobs. If you're going to a mall and spending and consuming there are people who are working there in retail, in private security, etc., etc. So those jobs are obviously a direct downstream effect of this increased productivity multiplier. Now, of course, I'm not saying the classic top-down model. I'm simply saying you, of course, try to make everybody as productive as possible, but you also want to try to keep as much of the pie of value addition within Indian arms, within Indian profits, within Indian wages and salaries and taxes. And that is what manufacturing basically does. So manufacturing in popular rhetoric is often sold as a job scheme, which is partially true. A lot of you'll hear a lot of economists saying, "Well, of course, India has still managed because of various regulations and labor laws," and again, that is partially true, to do relatively well in high tech manufacturing, the auto ancillaries. But what about textiles and shoes? So let's do PLI for that also. Fine, that's fine. We can try to do both, but do not underestimate the non-manufacturing benefit of having domestic, indigenized, partially indigenized manufacturing, because that profit and that dividend and those taxes and those salaries get rolled back into the Indian economy and investments. So we're still at the very early stages. If you make a phone worth $100, maybe the Indian ecosystem keeps $5, $3 of just like the Chinese did initially, right? And then you step on to higher and higher value addition because an ancillary system gets created around it, right? So when Mamata Banerjee lost the Tata project and went to Gujarat, Sanand, then a lot of suppliers to that Tata Motors plant gets around, and then there is what we call path dependence. So if somebody else wants to start up automobile factory, he or she then goes to that region of Sanand or Manesar or South Gurgaon in Haryana or the Andhra Tamil Nadu border. These are the three kind of big, and of course Pune. These are the 3-4 big kind of automobile clusters in India, right? So these things happen in clusters. So there is inertia, there is some kind of locking in effect, there is path dependence. So it's important, therefore, to use our scale to leverage it and get that manufacturing into India. We have to get that because a lot of the value addition at the end of the day, but even in strategic terms, right? Right now, the Americans are finding out, well, they have supported Ukraine, but they are running out of ammunition. And one of the reasons why the US was so powerful as a European ally in World War I and World War II for the Allies, and not for Germany, of course, was that it just had so much industrial capacity that if it could turn it around for war purposes in 1 or 2 years, it would just overwhelm. No, the fear is if the Americans get bogged down in Eastern Europe and suddenly Xi takes a wild risk and then similarly turns around the Chinese industrial ecosystem for war making purposes. Eventually, he might win or lose, or China may not benefit. That's a separate issue. Does the rest of the world have enough manufacturing capacity to even try to match? And therefore, it's one thing you just really cannot outsource beyond a point, right? So we have to do both. It's just completely wrong headed to assume that there is no slack, and therefore, if we are choosing one, we are somehow deprioritizing the other. We have to do both.
Coming to the second part of your thesis on this subject with regards to infrastructure and state capacity. So, of course, a lot of initiatives have been taken by the current government, especially infrastructure shoring up in the Northeast,
Yeah.
in Kashmir, a lot of new airports coming up. So, generally, what is your view on infrastructure, state capacity, and how do you see that helping?
Infrastructure is extremely important. As I said, that's one of the big reasons I said, you need coordination. That's what state capacity brings to the table. So, for example, Bihar's rivers have been flooding for time immemorial, right? But so were rivers in Europe. Uh, but what happened in Europe, what happened in Germany, what happened in Switzerland was you were able to dam the rivers. You were able to, basically tame nature. It's one of those things which I disagree with some people on, quote unquote, dharmic online ecosystem is they're against taming nature. But if you actually study the Mahabharata, the Pandavas are burning down forests, sometimes with the help of Krishna. I'm not going to that extreme. I'm simply saying man's rise to civilization is about using nature all around him, or at least making sure, to the extent possible, nature does not go against him. And that is basically another form of saying you build huge infrastructure, right? In that sense, at least you can have sympathy for the Nehruvian language, if not the other aspects of calling those massive dams in the early 1950s the temples of modern India, right? Because you can understand the sentiment. It's kind of Ayn Randian sentiment, but in a socialist setting, right? She's Ayn Rand is walking down Manhattan and she's just in love with the fact that humans can create something as beautiful as that. All the steel and the cement and all the things that the German romantics hated, right? Capital R, like the rural, bucolic kind of settings, and she's like, no, this is what we've achieved, and there is beauty to both. It is infrastructure is extremely important, because if you're driving from Delhi to Mumbai and it takes 20 hours instead of 10 hours, then it's not even 20 hours, it's more like 30-40 hours, because the truck wala will always sleep, right? He'll eat it. So effectively a factory in Noida, from JNPT or Gujarat port or Odisha or Bengal port, becomes 3-4 days away. And there is damage and there is loss. If it is partial perishable, there is economic loss and damage. And if you're competing with the rest of the world, 2-3% makes a big difference. Sometimes for low price but high volume businesses, 2-3% is all the profit margin. So the cost of transportation, the cost of logistics, and then of course human beings. Like human beings, if they can, for example, you and I live in Mumbai, and in Mumbai, of course, has a just completely separate real estate market from the rest of the country in terms of prices, right? And part of the reason is, of course, we are living in a quasi island. And if you had connected the quasi island, Mumbai proper, to Navi Mumbai, which we're now finally doing, which will happen by the end of the year, the Trans-Harbour link with Navi Mumbai, which is, I think, first floated in 1960s or something. Then, of course, to that extent, people can commute, save time, and therefore save rent or EMIs, and reinvest that in new jobs and new productivity and new businesses. So it's just simple common sense that Adam Smith said. Prosperity depends on productivity, which depends on specialization. Specialization depends on division of labor, which in turn depends on the extent of the market. So you and I could be just 2 kilometers away, but if it takes me 2 hours effectively to get from this point to that point, you and I are not really in commercial intercourse for all practical purposes. I think Neelkant Mishra, who's now with Axis, was earlier with Credit Suisse. I think 10 years ago, he had a great paper that as soon as you had pakka roads in villages, people stopped on the margin, sewing their own clothes. There would be professional cloth makers who would then serve 20-30 villages, or at least 5-7 villages, because now their catchment area was not just 500 or 1,000 people, it was effectively 10,000 people. And therefore, a certain business became viable for 10,000, which is not viable for 1,000 people. So just imagine doing that at 100,000 and 1 million and a billion, potentially up to 10 billion people for digital businesses, right? So infrastructure, both hard and soft, both digital and physical, along with human capital, has over a generation, maybe 30-40 years at most, when there were no bijli, no pani, no sadak in our villages, at least, or many of our slums. Those parts from village, that average Indian village has gone from being a self-contained economic unit and therefore being very poor, to suddenly being integrated, if not today, by 2030 to the entire global economy. Right? I mean, you could do this podcast business if you do it full time and you get enough ad monetization, etc., and your personal life allows it. You could be doing it from any part of Maharashtra, Haryana, or Rajasthan, etc. Right? And therefore, to that extent, you need not be paying for that kind of real estate, etc. So just imagine that productivity boom. So infrastructure is absolutely important. It's a classic long gestation investment. It's therefore it shows the importance of political stability. If there's too messy alliance or coalition governments, and then you have too much give and take on a short-term basis, you can't do this. For example, in large parts of Mumbai, anyways, the congested roads are half blocked because of metro construction, and people get slightly frustrated, etc., etc. But they understand that in 5 years or 6 years when it started, maybe in another 2 3 years, I'll have a metro line here, and it will double the capacity of the local train, etc., etc. And therefore, it's a classic short-term pain, long-term gain decision. And large parts of productivity enhancements are those kind of intertemporal decisions, are kind of those coordination paradoxes which only state capacity can solve. For state capacity to be occasionally activist, it is necessary for it to be seen as relatively clean, at least relatively incorrupt at the highest levels. For example, it's easier to do industrial trade policy where you don't think the prime minister is personally financially corrupt while also being capable of changing those policies. Because then this industrial trade policy will just devolve into crony capitalism, and maybe at some point it will, and therefore we'll have to reverse it. But right now, it's lesser of two evils. Of not even trying anything is not worth it. And which in turn then again goes back to politics and society and culture and civilization, which is like, okay, how do you have this relative stability? Because of a democracy. No other system can keep India united. But how do you have a non-neo-feudal system and relatively non-corrupt? Because more and more people are looking at the larger whole. They're voting as Indians. They're voting as, if I might say so, Hindus. And therefore they're saying, with Indian elections are no longer just a collection of 543 local elections aggregated, or its equivalent in state elections. There are wave elections in India. Karnataka might give a wave election result against BJP, and the same Karnataka might in Lok Sabha seats give a wave election result for BJP or Prime Minister Modi, showing that there's a 10% floating voter base. The Indian voter is nuanced, and it's giving clear results much more than earlier. So there is a sense of we are thinking, of course, for ourselves, individually as a community, etc., but also the larger cause. That civilizational awareness, that larger national awareness, is something relatively new. Is a virtuous cycle with economic prosperity. Is, as people, somebody from Tamil origin or Haryanvi origin is living in Mumbai or Calcutta or intermarries, etc., etc., he or she automatically thinks in those terms for themselves and their coming generations. That is what is changing in India. That is what is allowing this virtuous cycle where people are like, okay, wait a second, this actually makes sense for India. And there's a good stuff that V.S. Naipaul had observed in his 3 India books, when he went from progressively extremely despondent to cautiously optimistic, that initially he just did not see most Indians thinking as Indians. And we have lost this kind of quaint phrase of nation building. And which is in my second book, A New Idea of India, which has just been relaunched in second edition, and my co-author is Rajiv Mantri. The subtitle is Civilization Republic. The Civilization Republic is we say that India has always been a civilization, but in terms of a modern nation, it is relatively new. So there is no kind of, you don't have to believe and go all Churchill to say that you are still nation making while having very much that civilizational substratum, right? So that you are converting, or you're also becoming a nation, full-fledged, quote-unquote, modern one, from a civilization through the agency of a democratic civilizational state. And that process in turn increases economic growth because you are thinking as that. You are consciously or subconsciously giving the mandate to prioritize economic growth, which is basically what prioritizing infrastructure means. Because again, if you, I mean, you could just do this experiment in point X to point Y on Google Maps in India, compared to most parts of the US, Europe, or China, it's around roughly 2 times slower. Right? If it takes 5 hours for those kilometers, it takes around 10 hours here. And that might have been 13, 14, 15 hours, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right? So that it's just a case of, if you can go from Kashi to Patna in half the time, and all those parts of eastern UP and Bihar, which is the most dense population, and where the rivers used to be navigable, they no longer are, and we are finally building railroads. Just taking that as an example, India will be rich the day you can go from Kashi to Patna super fast, both through rail as well as road, both for people as well as for logistics of goods and freight. So that it's an excellent shorthand for where economic growth is going. And just quickly to add, a lot of Indian economists, um, and I myself am quote unquote American or foreign or Anglo-American trained or returned, having worked there or studied there or both. They just they came even from the right or left from the 1980s debates in the US, where infrastructure was already built in the US and UK, and so we were having these grand right-left debates. And here comes Narendra Modi, and he's like, "Do you really know that a lot of Indians are shitting out in the open and they don't have good sanitation, and that causes all kinds of disease? Do you know there's not a lot of potable water coming into their homes? Do you know that electricity might reach a village but not the final home? Those, and which is why I say, without romanticizing it too much, it at some point you needed somebody from who had lived that life to understand that his mother or mother-in-law or grandmother is choking from smoke because there is no clean gas for cooking, and so only and she should not walk for 2 hours to get drinking water, etc., or be very worried about going to the toilets in the fields, etc., in terms of safety and time. भाई वो सब होगा, उसके बाद ही तो इंसान कुछ प्रोडक्टिव सोचेगा ना. वो पढ़ेगा, फिर वो अपने बच्चे को पढ़ाएगा, फिर वो बोलेगा कुछ मेहनत करो, कुछ करते हैं. If your everyday existence just goes into making basic existence meet, right? I mean, you're just kind of keeping your head above water, so to speak, right? So which is why all those hours saved cumulatively will make a huge difference in the coming time, and a huge part of that is, um, you know and I personally, I mean, it's not in the financial sense, I have a big problem with working women. We should have discussed this earlier, but working women not being housewives not being counted as working women. So of course you are in a labor market sense. I understand what we are all saying, uh, but if you think about it, the Indian family structure and the fact that so much efforts are going to the education of the child, and even the poor person is saying कि नहीं private school में डालते हैं and tuition देते हैं अलग से, just 30-20% of his salary he's ready to put, right? And the mother is working so hard on it is a huge investment in the future, and that is not being counted as your percentage saving or percentage investment of GDP. But that time, which is not being monetized on your GDP accounts, is nothing but a huge investment in the future. Of course, that kind of investment happens only once, and once the transition happens, and you go for smaller families, etc., etc. The point is to keep it in balance. But right now, there are a lot of things which are being worked up. You can say the same, for example, about Pakistani families. Mothers are working hard for the kids, but not in an education sense. They're not getting good education, or for religious reasons, or for gender discrimination reasons, or for some any other reason. Even though it's even there, it's actually not getting worse, at least. But in India, they're working hard while understanding the importance of education, both for boys and girls. The anecdotal evidence being just the way the country responded to this latest, spacecraft launch that we had for the moon rover. It's just the way people are responding, right? It's so heartwarming. So I think that really shows the importance of infrastructure, human capital investment, and to count these investments in the right way, not just in a purely GDP sense. Of course, there's nothing better we have, but at least to keep in mind that there is something over and above that as well.
So, from a technology perspective, where do you see?
So technology is huge because, okay, there are two aspects of technology here to consider. One is energy, one is data. India's biggest macro weakness is that we are very commodity, especially energy import dependent. So, global crude prices go up and we have a big current account deficit, etc., etc. Because unlike Russia, Saudi, even partially China, and of course America of late with shale gas, we don't produce enough of our own energy. That is where the green energy transition, whether or not whatever you believe 10 years ago on anthropogenic climate change and global warming, and it's not a political debate. For India, it's a strategic imperative to make sure that we can produce our own energy, that we can have electric vehicles of some sort, or hybrid, or maybe hydrogen at some point, that we can actually have more and more of our industries and houses running from solar and wind and nuclear. And with solar and wind, we'll have to have batteries or some kind of storage, maybe kind of what is known as gravity storage, or what is classic hydro kind of storage. That will make massively Indian it may not decrease Indian crude imports in absolute terms, but as percent of GDP, it will reduce those imports. That will allow the rupee to further appreciate in real terms and potentially also in nominal terms, I actually believe, and therefore have a much higher GDP growth in hard dollar terms, but even in rupee terms. So the energy transition is very easy. We are one of the most dependent countries in the world on energy imports. And this great energy transition that we are seeing is almost an unprecedented positive for India. There are some angles about, as you're saying, about rare earth metals and materials and which country has a strategic lock on it. We found something very preliminary in Jammu and Kashmir, etc., etc. But eventually, there will be no Chinese monopoly on it. Worst case, we'll have to import something from Chile or Africa or Canada and so on and so forth. And hopefully, we'll get something in our own country. It's not like everything is perfectly rosy, but this transition is a huge positive for India. The second thing that's a huge positive for India is the data revolution, right? From geo, of course, India has now, I think, on a per capita basis, higher data usage than both US and China. And obviously are one of the world's lowest costs, if not the world's lowest cost. So that's just a huge compliment to the Indian private sector, and specifically Reliance Jio, for doing that kind of transition. A lot of people say crony capitalism. Crony capitalism hai to matlab, how can they give you something better at cheaper rates, right? I mean, they're still making money. So whether or not there is cronyism, and that's definitely a question worth examining in all its nuances, but the fact remains that he got something great for something super cheap because this guy came and exploited scale. What does that data mean? Given the tragedy of COVID, one thing nonetheless changed was that this attitude of doing hybrid work, of, like as I often say, like Skype has been around for more than a decade and we all used it, and internet quality may not have been great, but it was considered taboo to use that for professional reasons, right? But of course, the pandemic, I mean, I remember that when I was working outside India, and like we had all those softwares, but nobody would use it. You call the person or you go and meet the person. If you would call on a video conference, and it's perfectly fine, in most cases, again, there were exceptions, it would be seen as almost like, are you too busy or too much of a big shot to come and meet me, or just call me, or what are you trying to prove? It just had a taboo kind of attitude. And of course, Zoom completely changed it, and now we have Microsoft Teams, and we have like 100 softwares and this and that, and Cisco WebEx, etc. And now 5G is happening, and we just saw the launch of the latest Apple product, which may become a mass reality, those kind of augmented reality glasses, by say 2030. Okay, in another 7 years. It launches next year at a very expensive rate, but let us say it becomes mainstream, and there are Korean and Japanese knockoffs and Chinese knockoffs by 2030. And what is going to sell for $3,000 next year becomes $300 by 2030. Right? We've seen a similar trajectory for laptops and PCs and cell phones, etc. Now you suddenly are like, wait a second, why do I need a $50,000 receptionist in Manhattan? Okay, maybe I'm just too rich and I don't care, and it's just a status symbol. But the point is, most businesses can actually just have a large screen there. Somebody sitting in Thane, just meeting and greeting. Most people are coming. Most people just need directions. So just somebody to talk to about, hey, where do I go? You can just literally have, I know it sounds really bizarre, you can just have a robot, but with a screen in which this person is sitting completely across the world, and who is happily doing that job instead of $50,000 for $10,000. That person need not get a visa. There's no immigration angle. So it's not a political hot potato in that sense. Of course, it'll eventually become a political hot potato because too many, after blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs start getting outsourced to that extent. But I'm just giving an example of so much that can be done, right? There's so much more labor arbitrage yet to be done in this world because it was technologically not feasible, right? I mean, internet is already there, but sometimes the internet hangs, sometimes it is too slow, sometimes it's not realistic enough. But if it's realistic enough, in say by 2030, if it's like a quasi hologram and there's very low latency, then why not? Right? I mean, then why do you not want to learn yoga from somebody in Kerala who is again ready to do a $20 per hour class or $10 per hour class, whereas some really well-known yoga teacher in Boston might charge you at least $100 an hour, for example, right? Or even the relatively new ones might charge you $50 an hour. And you can just do in sector after sector, in sector after sector. And that is just a massive proliferation of services outsourcing and exports from India, not just through traditional IT companies, but more generally business services. what is known as global capability centers for in-house centers or global research and development centers or GICs, etc. There are many labels to it, and it's a big driver of Indian commercial real estate right now. But you can also have more decentralized outsourcing, right, across the chain. And then, what, $10,000 in India, in smaller towns, is somebody who can have a very comfortable life with that. And so it's just a no-brainer kind of trade, which I think is not, a lot of people are not grappling with it. In fact, literally one of the persons who does, I'm forgetting his name right now, has written the book called The Great Convergence. I think Richard Baldwin. And he calls it the third unbundling, right? The first unbundling was on distance, the second was on data, and this is finally on presence, like location, something like that. And so it's something very important to understand that we are just scratching the surface on intermediate service exports also. Like, even if the end final B2C financial and legal services exports are kind of regulated by SEC in the US or the judicial system in the US, you can export those legal and financial services to the final layer there. Like, as a B2B service, you can always export. You just don't get to interface with the clients directly, right, in India. That also has enormous scope for export. So I think it's just, we are, the number of people who are coming online, and every single cohort I anecdotally see is just more confident and better prepared than the one 5 years before and same 5 years before that. It just seems obvious to me that, they will, in that sense, take over the world. So, that is why I think technology, there were two broad buckets of technology. One was what we call the energy transition, and the second was this data services, kind of augmented reality. Even though the metaverse initially kind of became a hype bubble and then burst, it was not the right framing, metaverse, and then of course the whole crypto thing happened. But I think, which I was very skeptical of from day one, but this kind of very obvious labor arbitrage is yet to be exploited.
One thing I wanted to ask you is with regards to the infrastructure part that you mentioned. The American model is that you have a lot of cities, like every state will have multiple cities, right?
Right.
And small cities, it need not be a metropolis, but
Right.
they are very heavily urbanized across states.
Of course.
And the Chinese also have many cities, but a friend of mine who recently went to China said that every village in China specializes in producing some item. They manufacture something. There's some specialization. Where do you see the long India? Which model do you see India going towards? Because my most important concern for India is everything is associated, all the major developments seem to happen around those 6 to 10 big cities. And the gap between a like a town and a city in India is huge compared to what it is in the US, and villages are nowhere near the kind of scale that China are. So
No, it is, but it's just multi-speed in the sense that, well, there's a power law of cities. I mean, across large countries, the largest is like roughly twice the other. Second one, which is roughly another 50-70% bigger. I mean, for example, New York, and then LA, and then Chicago, and then Houston, Dallas is separate. Yes, America is massively urbanized, but also massively decentralized. That again goes back to infrastructure, right? If we can actually, a lot of these places are kind of quasi suburbs or conurbations. They're large, decentralized urban areas, polycentric areas, like the U.S. East Coast, Northeast Coast, the New England extended, it's called the Boss-Wash corridor, Boston to Washington D.C., and New York and Philadelphia is in the middle. This whole thing is around, I don't know, 40-50 million people. And it's probably the most economically productive part of the world. I think kind of Tokyo to Kyoto might be close. And also the Ruhr region in Germany. And of course now China is also kind of going for three massive cities. One of them is around Beijing, one is around Shanghai, and one is around, cities, the right word, three massive urban regions. And the one is around Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. In China, historically, there was this concept of PVEs, town and village enterprises. So, and plus, of course, they are relatively stronger in manufacturing as a percentage of economy, both in absolute output as well compared to the US. So there is a specialization of a product. which in India we tried with one district, one product. It's easy. It's more difficult to do in India. Again, unless the infrastructure fully catches up. So I understand what your friend observed. India is true. It's just, I think it's a matter of time. I think we're in the very early stages of what you're saying, where we will have tier two towns disproportionately growing. I think we're already seeing that in Gujarat, where Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar, well, they've now become twin cities. Surat, Vadodara, Rajkot growing very well. Mumbai, Pune, Navi Mumbai is getting closer to Pune. Then there is a missing link corridor on the Mumbai Pune Expressway, which further shorten the distance by half an hour. That'll also launch next year. But I think, and Kerala is also very kind of very, very populated on its sea coast, and they're talking of a silver line, which might just become a conventional semi-high speed train. But the big kind of prize here is the Ganga Valley, right? It's the from UP, Bihar to Bengal, especially UP and Bihar, NCR, Lucknow, Kanpur region, and then East UP and Bihar have densities north of 1,000 people per square kilometer, which is like just Bihar is maybe 120 million people right now, and Eastern UP is maybe around 100 million, 120 million more people. So that's quarter of a billion people in 200,000 square kilometers or so. And that's a greater density than Greater New York. And a lot of villages in India are also not properly counted. They should, by a lot of international standards, be cities or towns. We have very kind of unique. We underestimate our own urbanization rate. Like it should be greater than 5,000, and this percentage of men should be working in agriculture or non-agriculture, and this and that. And then there is a kind of collective incentive angle, because the moment you become a town, you get something like a municipality and you have to levy taxes, as opposed to if you're a village, you're getting money from the state government and central government. So, for example, again, Eastern UP and Bihar have similar, if not higher densities than coastal Kerala. But Kerala is considered 100% urban almost, and Eastern UP and Bihar is considered 10-20% urban, right? So there is a lot of nuance here which gets lost. But what will happen going forward, and UP is now becoming the state of expressways and international airports, etc. Bihar obviously is further behind, but if you take a 10-20 year view, you will basically see NCR, Lucknow, Kanpur, and then Eastern UP entering kind of Patna. And Eastern UP, I mean Kashi and Prayag and Gorakhpur and Patna and northern Bihar and northeastern UP up to the Nepal border. This whole thing will become the world's largest urban region of, like, if you take parts of Bengal or parts of the border regions of Rajasthan and Haryana and northern MP, maybe up to 400 million people. And it will just become with 3-4 big centers like NCR, Lucknow, Kanpur will become a twin city. And Patna, or what I once wrote, make India's capital to be Patliputra, the new Patna, etc. So that, I think that will happen, and that's just natural. It will happen because people will decentralize. And honestly, while right now nobody believes in autonomous cars, and the technology kind of has disappointed for 5-7 years, and nonetheless, it will happen at some point. I mean, you cannot talk of AI and then also say autonomous cars won't happen. The two kind of don't go together as two kind of separate but related hypotheses. So if autonomous cars happen not in 2020s but say late 2030s also, or even mid 2030s, and by then we have better roads, etc., you'll have a further suburbanization across the world, right? Because if you can literally sleep in your car from home to office, you can live further away from office, and therefore you can have a larger house. And that what will allow is this entire kind of, think of all of UP Bihar. I mean, this is going to sound ridiculous to some people and romantic to a lot of people, as one large Greater Noida, right? That's basically what will end up happening, with some really kind of big CBDs in the middle with massive skyscrapers, etc., and crazy real estate rents. So we have to do some future gazing here, and I think it's just a question of infrastructure, because once you do the infrastructure, you don't need to convince anybody, right? That the factory one, the logistics guy, the guy who wants kind of go down to keep his work in progress inventory, he or she will automatically go for the lowest rental cost. Same for good quality offices, same for good quality houses. It's a matter of building out that infrastructure in the real estate stock. Then you have to come to finance and interest rates, so it'll get too long. But basically, I think it'll happen because we are finally putting the building blocks of infrastructure, right? The fact that you have a Ganga expressway, you now have a Delhi to Lucknow expressway, you have an expressway from Meerut to Prayag, and then going on to Balia and the Bihar border, and then we're talking about across North Bihar from the Darjeeling region to Lucknow and Gorakhpur, down to Calcutta. Then it's we badly need the infrastructure. For example, there is no good north-south expressway in West Bengal. It's a relatively densely populated region, narrow, of course, because a large part went to East Pakistan, then Bangladesh, and we just don't. It's very difficult to drive up from Calcutta to, you know, forget Gangtok.
Like Calcutta to Darjeeling?
Yes,
How was the road?
it's just a terrible road, because it never came under the quadrilateral or the
My God.
so things like that, right? I mean, and of course, rural Bengal is absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's just, you just if you then the amplifying effects of tourism, of people not spending money abroad on the margin, being in India. A lot of foreigners coming to India. So much potential in India if you just put good infrastructure and then good hotels, etc. Have moderate taxation. So I think all that will happen is just kind of a virtuous cycle. It does not mean you become complacent. I know it does not mean you have a very kind of Panglossian view on everything. कि सब कुछ automatically हो जाएगा, सोने चले जाओ, खाली index fund खरीद लो. But my point is nonetheless, your analyst view has to be different from your activist view. As an activist, I can keep on whining about X, Y, Z. But as an analyst, I think even the politics is endogenous, and to that extent, it is not dependent on one great man or party. Of course, that one great man or party helps on the margin significantly, but even that great man or party becomes an outcome of the changes in social views, political views, religious views, which leads to that kind of person being elected. So it becomes partially endogenous. So which is why I think these are very important, kind of underappreciated factors, and I think a lot of people will just continue to get, in my view, be surprised on the upside by India, and they'll keep on saying, "Kaise ho gaya? Nahi, ye problem hai." See, India, in just imagine what India has gone through in the last 30, 40 years, right? I mean, Kashmir Jihad, Khalistan separatism, Naxal communist movement, Maoist movement, riots, terrible corruption, just absolutely. I mean, if you're a middle class guy and you like, a lot of people went abroad because of this reason, because they're like, just what's the point? But nonetheless, India has one of the smoothest per capita GDP growth increases across countries from the last 40 years. It's roughly been rising by 1 percentage point per decade on a per capita basis. Roughly in line with our demographic change, actually. Both our demographics, kind of in terms of dependency ratio, bottomed out both for India and China in the 1970s. So what I'm saying is there is a lot of micro, but there's a lot of macro as well. And despite all the bad news that you and I read about on a daily basis, things just kept on getting better in India for 40 years. In fact, in many ways, I see 1977 to be as much of a turning point as 1947, because 1977 is when we made sure India remains a democracy no matter what. Is when the emergency was finally taken off by Indira Gandhi. So in that sense, 1977 is a critical date that people forget between 1947 and 1991. That's a very, very important date because it made sure that India remains a democracy. And because India remains a democracy, it remains united. Because it remains united, all those economies of scale, largest polity becoming largest economy, economic convergence, things start playing out. Because, a lot of people would, if not consciously, subconsciously like to see India disintegrate. Even Barack Obama's views very interesting in the latest Modi visit that, if ye ho jayega, India might disintegrate, etc. And people have been saying that since the 1940s, since the late 1940s, that, India is, people used to say that about Nehru actually. After Nehru, Churchill famously said India is as much a country as the equator. I mean, and, Hindus are a terrible people, the terrible, beastly people with a beastly religion. But you don't have to be Churchill. A lot of people who are not as crazy about India or as, effed up in the mind about India as Churchill was, a lot of people still doubted India's existence, which is why they still can't quite make what to think about India. And when India is finally getting rich, I think there is a subconscious reaction to go to, but India is no longer a democracy; it's an electoratocracy. और या फिर डायस्पोरा में कास्ट का एंगल ले आओ, because you have to find some coping mechanism to kind of make sense of it, because at the end of the day you want to say democracy is a Western value and a universal value, and there's a contradiction in it because there is a 1.4 billion strong Indian contradiction in it. So ये चीजें रहेंगी, but let's summarize by simply saying that it's not economics, it's always political economy. And below political economy, it's not just politics or economics, it's philosophy and civilization and what keeps the country together, right? So maybe we discuss that, and of course broader things whenever we catch up next, and we can use that as a peg to discuss dharmatva, and also how these things correlate to capitalism versus other economic models, but also then we can focus more strongly on my dharmatva kind of thesis or view.
Absolutely. With that, we come to the end of this podcast on a very positive note.
1.5 hours.
Yeah.
I'll simply say, whoever is watching, if you can, please start a business. If you want to go outside to learn something and get some great skill, please do. But then try to come back, maybe if your personal life allows. So take risks, invest in India, convince others to invest in India. And if after 30, 40 years it doesn't work out, please come and sue me. It's fine.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. It was a very insightful discussion with Harsh, as I expected it would be. And please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, guys. Until next time, see you around.